All right, so today we are going to be diving into some pretty incredible new archaeological research coming out of Ecuador. We've got a whole bunch of new academic journal articles, and they're all focused on this really unique burial from the Manteño period. And what's so cool about this is that it's not like your typical ancient burial, you know?
Yeah,
We're talking some potentially unsettling artifacts, possible human sacrifice, and even connections to much older cultures.
yeah, it's really fascinating because this burial could really rewrite what we thought we knew about the Manteño people and how their culture evolved.
Yeah, for sure.
Oh,
Okay,
yeah.
so before we get into all the details, let's just do a real quick recap for anyone who needs it. The Manteño people lived on the coast of Ecuador from about 650 to 1532 AD. They were really known for their agriculture and architecture, and they were even skilled seafarers.
Yeah, and it's important to note that there were three distinct regional groups within the Manteño culture. You have the Manteño del Norte,
Mhm.
the Huancavilca, and then also the Punes.
Right, and the site that we're going to be focusing on today, it's called Buen Suceso, and it's right in that zone where the Huancavilca and Manteño del Norte cultures were overlapping, so it's kind of a cultural crossroads.
Exactly. The researchers actually call it a liminal zone, which is kind of a fancy way of saying it was a place where all these different cultural influences came together.
I like that. Liminal zone. Okay, so this burial, which archaeologists have labeled as Burial 10, it was found in 2022, and it was found during excavations at Buen Suceso. But here's where things get a little interesting. The site itself mostly dates to the Valdivia period, which is thousands of years before the Manteño.
That's right. The Valdivia period actually lasted from about 3750 to 1475 BC, so significantly older. But through radiocarbon dating, the archaeologists were able to confirm that burial 10 is definitely from that Manteño period, somewhere between 771 and 953 AD.
Wow, okay, so we've got this Manteño burial right in the middle of a much older Valdivia site. That kind of sets off some alarm bells, right? Like, what is going on here?
It definitely raises some questions about how the Manteño people might have been interacting with the remnants of this much older culture.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Okay, so let's talk about the burial itself. The skeletal remains are of a young woman, estimated to be between 17 and 20 years old, and she was pregnant at the time of her death.
And not just a little pregnant either. Based on the analysis of the skeleton, it seems that she was probably about 7 to 9 months along.
Wow, so that's already pretty unusual, isn't it? To find a burial of a pregnant woman from this period.
It is. It's not unheard of, but it's certainly not common. And it immediately raises all these questions about the social and cultural significance of pregnancy and childbirth in Manteño society.
For sure. So were pregnant women seen in a special way? Did they have any particular power or status?
That's definitely something that we can delve into a little bit later when we start looking at the artifacts that they found in the burial. But for now, let's just kind of focus on the woman herself. The analysis of her skeleton revealed some pretty stark details about her life.
Okay, so let's unpack this. What can her bones tell us?
Well, first of all, it's clear that this woman had a lot of hardship during her life. She had signs of various health issues that likely stemmed from malnutrition and disease.
Okay, like what kind of health issues? Paint us a picture.
So, for example, she had something called cribro-orbitalia, which is basically a porous condition in the eye sockets. It's often caused by iron deficiency anemia. And then she also had parotid hyperostosis, which are these pitted lesions on the skull. And those can be a sign of malnutrition or chronic illness.
So even before we get to the circumstances of her death, we're seeing evidence of a really difficult life.
Exactly. And the evidence doesn't stop there. She also had linear enamel hypoplasia, which are these lines on the teeth that indicate periods of stress or illness during her childhood. And there were even signs of bone infections as well.
Wow, it sounds like she really went through a lot. But the real mystery, of course, is how she died. So what can the researchers tell us about that?
Well, there's evidence of trauma on her bones, including cut marks, fractures, and get
Okay.
this, her left leg and hands were missing.
Missing, like they were removed before she was buried.
It seems that way. And while the researchers believe that she ultimately died from blunt force trauma to the head, they can't say for sure whether it was intentional or accidental.
So we have this pregnant young woman who lived a hard life and then died a violent or at least very unusual death. But it's the artifacts that were found buried with her that really start to paint a more detailed picture of what might have happened.
Right. The grave goods are often the key to understanding the beliefs and practices of a culture. And in this case, the artifacts are really quite a mixed bag, which is part of what makes this burial so compelling.
Okay, I am hooked. Give us the rundown of what they found.
Well, they found some things that you might expect in a Manteño burial, like fragments of ceramics, But then there were also some very unexpected items. For example, they found arc clam shells placed over her eyes.
Interesting. What could that symbolize?
It's really hard to say for sure, but it's certainly not a common practice in other Manteño burials. There was also a green clay stone found near her head.
Okay, so clamshells and a green stone. What else?
And then things start to get really interesting. They found these crescent-shaped ornaments that were made from spondylus shell. They're called mascaras.
Mascaras. What are those?
So they're these crescent-shaped ornaments, and they're usually associated with the Valdivia culture. Remember that much older culture that we talked about earlier.
Wait, so these are artifacts from a culture that predates the Manteño by thousands of years. What are they doing in this burial?
That's one of the big questions that the researchers are trying to answer. It suggests some kind of connection or continuity between these two cultures that are separated by such a vast amount of time.
Okay, my mind is officially blown. What else was in this burial?
Well, alongside the mascaras, they also found some more typical Manteño items, like rectangular spondylus pendants and then spondylus beads that are called chakira. But then they found something else totally unexpected, obsidian blades.
Obsidian blades. That seems pretty out there for a Manteño burial, right?
Definitely. Obsidian blades aren't something that we typically associate with the Manteño people. So it's another anomaly that points to the unique nature of this burial.
So we've got the clamshells, a green stone, Valdivia mascaras, obsidian blades. It's like this bizarre collection of items from all these different eras.
Exactly. And it doesn't end there. Sometime after the initial burial, it seems that someone came back and placed a burnt offering in her chest cavity. And this offering was carbon dated to between 991 and 1025 AD, so decades after she was originally buried.
Whoa, so decades later, someone comes back to this grave and adds a burnt offering. Why? What was the purpose?
It's tough to say, but it really speaks to the long-lasting significance of this burial, and possibly some kind of ongoing ritualistic practices associated with it.
It's like a mystery novel, just unfolding layer by layer.
And to add one final piece to the puzzle, they also found a star-shaped mace that was made of limestone, and it was found near the burial.
A mace, like a weapon.
Exactly. And when you consider the mace, along with all of the other evidence, the trauma to her bones, the missing limbs, the unusual artifacts, it really starts to paint a pretty disturbing picture.
Okay, I think we are ready to dive into the researchers' theory about what really happened to this young woman. Let's get into that in part 2 of our deep dive. Okay, so we left off with this pretty heavy question. Could this young woman have been a victim of human sacrifice? That's a pretty big claim. What leads the researchers to even think that?
Well, it really comes down to the totality of the evidence.
Yeah.
You know, when you look at the trauma to her skeleton, all those cut marks and fractures, the missing limbs, and then you factor in all of the unusual burial goods, it really starts to point to something more deliberate, something ritualistic.
So it's not just that she died violently, but it's the way she was buried, the specific items that were included that really suggest that something bigger was at play.
Exactly. It's really that combination of all of these factors that's so compelling. For instance, the mascaras, those crescent-shaped shell ornaments, they're typically associated with the Valdivia culture, which, as we discussed, predates the Manteño by thousands of years.
Right. And you mentioned that the green clay stone that was found near her head also has ties to the Valdivia. What was the significance of those items to the Valdivia people?
Well, we don't have any written records from the Valdivias,
Yeah.
so a lot of what we know is really based on archaeological evidence and interpretations. But these mascaras are often found in Valdivia burials, and they seem to represent some kind of connection to the spiritual realm, perhaps even to ancestors.
So if the Manteño people were incorporating these Valdivia artifacts into their own burial rituals, does that mean that they shared some of the same beliefs?
It's certainly possible. It really suggests at least a certain level of cultural continuity, or at least a conscious effort to connect with the traditions of the past. And this is an idea that's further reinforced by the presence of that green clay stone as well.
Right. And you mentioned earlier that the green stone was also thought to have some kind of symbolic meaning for the Valdivia. What was that again?
What was often found in Valdivia burials, particularly those of women and children. And it's thought to represent a link between death and fertility, kind of that cyclical nature of life and rebirth.
Wow, that adds a whole other layer to this burial. So we have this pregnant woman, artifacts that might symbolize a connection to ancestors and the cycle of life and death, and then you have the violence, the missing limbs. It's almost like a story's being told, but we're missing some of the pages.
That's a great way to put it. We're really just getting these glimpses into a belief system that we can only partially understand. And this is kind of where those obsidian blades come back into the picture.
Right, the obsidian blades. I'm still stuck on those. They're so out of place in a Manteño burial. Do the researchers have any theories about why those might have been included?
Unfortunately, there's no easy answer. The obsidian itself likely came from the Andes Mountains, which tells us a little bit about trade networks and the movement of materials. But their symbolic significance in this particular context is really a mystery. Were they considered ritual objects, weapons, tools for some specific practice that we don't know about? We just don't know.
It's like trying to solve a puzzle, but with some of the pieces missing. But speaking of missing pieces, there's one other element that we haven't really touched on yet. That burnt offering that was added to the grave decades later. What can we even make of that?
That's perhaps one of the most intriguing aspects of this whole discovery. It speaks to a level of interaction with the dead that goes beyond simply burying them and moving on.
So it wasn't just this one-time burial ritual. It's like they were coming back to this grave, interacting with it, possibly even performing ceremonies there decades after this woman's death.
Precisely. And that raises all sorts of questions about how the Manteño people conceived of the afterlife, the relationship between the living and the dead, and the importance of maintaining those connections over time.
It's almost like this burial was a focal point for their community, a place where they could connect with their ancestors, their history, their beliefs.
And if we consider the location of the burial as well, in this liminal zone where the Huancavilca and Manteño del Norte cultures were kind of overlapping, it might have even held greater significance.
Yeah.
Perhaps it was a place where different groups came together, a site of shared rituals and beliefs.
It's so fascinating to think about how this one burial is really challenging so much of what we thought we knew about the Manteño. But let's go back to the idea of human sacrifice for a moment. You said earlier that the researchers are kind of proposing that as a possibility. Do they have any evidence beyond what we've already discussed? Or is it mainly speculation at this point?
It's primarily based on the evidence that we've already talked about. The trauma, the missing limbs, the unusual artifacts. There's no smoking gun, so to speak, no definitive proof that this woman was intentionally killed as part of some kind of ritual.
So we have to be careful not to jump to conclusions. There could be other explanations for the trauma to her skeleton. Maybe she was attacked. Or maybe there was some kind of accident. And the missing limbs, well, that could have happened after death for any number of reasons.
Absolutely. We have to be open to all possibilities. And it's important to remember that we're looking at this through a very modern lens, with our own cultural biases and assumptions about death and ritual.
Right. We can't just impose our own interpretations on the past. But even if we can't say for sure what happened to this woman, her burial is still incredibly valuable because it's forcing us to ask these questions, to challenge our assumptions, and to consider all these different perspectives.
Exactly. And that's what makes archaeology so exciting. It's not about finding definitive answers, but it's about exploring the possibilities, piecing together these fragments of evidence, and constantly revising our understanding of the past.
So where do we go from here? What are some of the key takeaways that we should be considering as we move into the final part of our deep dive?
I think one of the most important takeaways is that this burial is just this powerful reminder that cultures are not static. They're constantly evolving, adapting, and borrowing from each other. This idea of a pure Manteño culture is really just kind of a misconception. Their beliefs and practices were really shaped by this complex web of influences, including interactions with much older cultures like the Valdivia.
And we see that so clearly in this burial. With the Valdivia artifacts, the possible blending of rituals and beliefs, it's like a snapshot of a culture in transition, grappling with its past and shaping its own unique identity.
Exactly. And I think another key takeaway is that we need to be really careful about imposing our own interpretations on the past. We may never know for sure what happened to this woman, but her burial is really a testament to the power of archaeology to reveal the complexity and the richness of human experience, even across these vast stretches of time.
It's a reminder that there's always more to learn, always more to discover, and that every new find has the potential to rewrite the history books. So let's delve into those final insights in the last part of our deep dive. Okay, so we've covered so much in this deep dive into Burial 10. We've talked about the pregnant woman, the artifacts, the possibility of sacrifice, even that mixing of cultures. What stands out to you as like the most significant piece of all of this?
I think what's most striking is how this burial makes us think differently about cultural identity. We always want to think about ancient cultures as these like fixed things, but this burial really shows us that they were constantly evolving. They were borrowing from the past, adapting, creating something totally new.
Right, it's like we can see the Manteño engaging with their own history, like picking and choosing what resonated with them and creating this new tapestry of beliefs.
Yeah, and it's fascinating because they're not just inheriting these traditions, They're reinterpreting them.
Hmm.
Like those mascaras, for instance. They probably had a totally different meaning to the Manteño than they did to the Valdivia people all those years before.
So even though we don't have written records to tell us exactly what they believed, we can see those beliefs in how they buried their dead, the objects they included, the rituals.
Exactly. And that's what's so cool about archaeology. It's like we get to access these layers of meaning that would be totally lost otherwise.
Now, we've talked a lot about the connection to the Valdivia culture, but what about the Manteño themselves? What does this burial tell us about their understanding of life and death and their place in the world?
That's a great question. And I think one of the big things we can take away from this is that the Manteño were really preoccupied with fertility and the cyclical nature of life and death.
What makes you say that?
Well, we have the pregnant woman, of course, and then we have those artifacts that seem to link back to the Valdivia beliefs about death and rebirth, like that green clay stone.
Oh, right, the greenstone. That was often found in Valdivia burials, especially women and children, right? And it's thought to symbolize that connection between life and death.
Exactly. And then you have that someone came back to the grave decades later and added a burnt offering. So death wasn't seen as the end for them. It was a transition, a continuation.
Like they were maintaining a relationship with their dead, honoring them, seeking their guidance, maybe even protection.
And if this burial was really a site of ritualistic practices, and the evidence points to that, then it shows just how important those rituals were. Connecting the community to the spiritual realm, to the forces that they believed governed their world.
Now, we can't talk about this burial without mentioning the possibility of sacrifice. We talked about the evidence, but we still don't have a definite answer. Does that lack of a clear answer make this discovery less valuable?
No, not at all. I actually
Not at
think it
all.
makes it more valuable because it forces us to realize we don't know everything and be okay with that. We might never know for sure what happened to this woman, but that doesn't mean we can't learn from her burial.
It reminds us that history is not always a neat and tidy story. There are gaps and mysteries and different ways of seeing things.
And I think it also reminds us to be humble about the past. We can't just put our own values and beliefs onto these ancient cultures. We have to consider that they saw the world very differently than we do.
So what is like the final takeaway for our listeners today? What do you want them to think about?
Well, I would say think about this. If archaeologists found one of our burials thousands of years from now, what would they think?
Yeah.
What stories would they tell about us based on, what we're buried with, how we treat our dead, the stuff we leave behind?
Whoa, that is a great question. Makes you realize we are all part of this huge human story. And our choices today will affect how people understand us in the future.
Exactly. And who knows, maybe one day archaeologists will find a burial that changes everything they thought they knew about us, just like Burial 10 has changed what we thought about the Manteño.
And that's what makes it so exciting. Always more to learn, more to discover. So until next time, keep those minds curious and remember, the past is always full of surprises.